It was upon a particularly fog-laden evening in November that I found myself, as so often, hurrying back to our Baker Street lodgings, the gas lamps casting their wavering glow upon the slick cobblestones, and my mind still burdened by the ceaseless worries of the day. London in winter has always possessed a certain melancholy, a mist that seems to cling to your very thoughts, muting them, as if the city itself were conspiring to hush even the most ardent contemplations. It was in this gloom that a summons arrived, one of those rare, unexpected invitations that set the pulse racing and the mind alert. The messenger, a young lad of no more than 15, bore a small, elaborately sealed envelope. The wax bore an unfamiliar crest, a shield split by a diagonal, within which a single strikingly rendered clock face was engraved. I handed the missive to Holmes, who had been perched in his customary chair near the hearth, pipe in hand, eyes alight with that peculiar gleam of anticipation which invariably presaged a new puzzle. "Chichet, Watson!" he exclaimed, rising with a grace that belied the creaking floorboards beneath him. "It seems the fates have conspired to relieve us from the monotony of medical consultation notes and correspondence from tedious acquaintances. Observe the seal. Notice the exact alignment of the hands on the clock. They are, curiously, positioned at 5 minutes to midnight." I regarded him with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, as was my custom. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "the sender has merely chosen a decorative motif for their stationery." Holmes shook his head, the thin fingers of his right hand tapping the envelope as if playing a silent symphony. "Far too precise, my dear Watson. The clock, the position of the hands, the minute irregularity in the seal, all signify purpose. There is more here than the casual choice of a stationery designer. I should wager that it is our mystery calling." He swiftly broke the seal, and from the envelope there emerged a note, composed in a careful, almost artistic hand. I noticed at once that the ink was of a peculiar shade, neither the black of ordinary writing ink, nor quite the rich blue one might expect. There was something unnatural in its hue. Holmes, of course, observed this with his customary acuity. "Read it aloud, Watson," he instructed. I cleared my throat and began. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am in desperate need of your assistance. Something most unnatural has occurred within my household, and the authorities, though competent in their own right, appear utterly confounded. I beg you to come to my residence at once. I fear that what I cannot understand may yet defy even rational comprehension. Your humble servant, Edward Thorne, Eskin, 17 Chesham Place, Westminster." Holmes's eyes gleamed with unmistakable intensity. "Do you see, Watson? The writer has been careful to couch his fear in terms of rationality, yet the insistence upon the unnatural and defy comprehension betrays a mind teetering upon the edge of terror. And note the peculiar specificity of the address. Westminster, but not a street one encounters in everyday perambulation. A house of means, yet one perhaps ill-accustomed to intrusions of the unusual." I sensed at once that the case promised the very brand of challenge that stirred Holmes's most relentless energies. It was, I knew, no mere burglary, nor a trivial domestic quarrel. There was a weight of menace beneath the polite phrasing of the letter, a quiet urgency that made the hair at the nape of one's neck bristle. "I suppose we must go, then?" I asked, attempting to mask the thrill that had begun to quicken my pulse. Holmes merely nodded. Within the hour, we were ensconced in a hansom cab, rattling over the uneven streets toward Westminster, the fog parting and curling around our wheels, as though the city itself sought to conceal the mysteries that lay ahead. Holmes remained silent for most of the journey, his gaze alternately fixed upon the shifting shadows and the buildings that emerged through the mist like solemn sentinels. Occasionally he would murmur a word or two, mostly observations of London life, yet even these contained the hidden precision for which he was famed. Upon our arrival at 17 Chesham Place, the house revealed itself in the manner of a relic, both imposing and slightly sinister, its brickwork darkened by years of soot and rain, its windows aglow with the muted light of gas lamps within. A butler, tall and angular, received us, his manner formal, yet betraying the slightest tremor of apprehension. "Mr. Thorne awaits you in the drawing-room. Mr. Holmes," he intoned, leading the way through a corridor lined with ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow us as we passed. "He has been troubled, sir. Some peculiar events." Holmes gave nothing away as we entered the room. Mr. Thorne was a man of refined presence, though there was an evident pallor about his features, the strain of sleepless nights written plainly across his face. He rose at our entrance, extending a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice steady, yet carrying the undercurrent of alarm. "I thank you for coming so promptly. I fear you will find my predicament unusual." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Pray, Mr. Thorne, describe to us what has occasioned such disturbance. Every detail, no matter how trivial it may seem, could be vital." Thorne hesitated, then, as though steeling himself, spoke. "It began last night at precisely 11:55, when the great clock in our hall, an ancient timepiece, as you may imagine, struck its first chime. Yet there was no sound. At midnight it struck again, silently. Then, an hour later, the same phenomenon occurred. I have witnessed it myself. And yet when I question my staff, they report nothing amiss. The clock appears normal, yet it strikes in silence, and—" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And this is the singular anomaly?" "No, sir," Thorne replied, a flicker of desperation in his gaze, "for, accompanying these silent strikes, there are footsteps. On the ceiling of the hall below, footsteps, though the floors above are empty. My household is composed of diligent servants, yet they swear they traverse no upper rooms during the night. And yet the sound persists, hauntingly precise, as though some invisible presence walks tirelessly above our heads." I felt a chill creep along my spine. The scenario seemed, to ordinary reasoning, impossible, and yet as Holmes sat forward, steepling his fingers, I observed in him that unmistakable glimmer, the one I have come to recognize as the precise moment when the case captures his entire attention. "Most extraordinary. Watson," he murmured, "and far from trivial, Mr. Thorne. You have summoned us at the exact juncture when logical observation may yet prevent panic from taking hold. Pray, leave nothing unmentioned. The timing, the location, the hours, the staff routines. Every nuance may prove a key." And so, as the first chapter of this mystery unfolded before us, I realized with no small thrill that we were about to embark upon a case unlike any other. A clock striking in silence, footsteps without a pedestrian, and the trembling anxiety of a household that had begun to distrust even its own senses. Little did we know, this was but the first note in a melody of enigmas that would challenge the very bounds of reason itself. As I took up my pen in the quiet of Baker Street later that evening, recording the beginning of what promised to be an unforgettable investigation, I could not help but glance at Holmes. He sat, pipe aglow, eyes fixed upon the fire as though it whispered answers only he could understand, and I, loyal chronicler, could only watch and marvel as the first shadow of mystery began to take shape in the lamplight of a London fog. The morning following our initial visit to Chesham Place dawned grey and oppressive, the city draped once more in its customary shroud of fog and mist. I awoke to the familiar scent of pipe smoke, and the gentle click of Holmes methodically arranging his papers on the small table beside the hearth, his silhouette illuminated by the pale light filtering through the curtained window, gave the impression of a man already consumed by thought, as if the world outside no longer bore any significance until this particular puzzle had been solved. "Good morning, Watson," he said without turning, his tone clipped yet oddly animated. "Prepare yourself. Today we shall visit Mr. Thorne's residence in detail. There are anomalies to observe, and I should imagine you may find them illuminating." I dressed quickly, my mind abuzz with curiosity. The notion of a clock striking in silence, coupled with phantom footsteps above an empty ceiling, was unlike any case I had previously encountered, though I had witnessed Holmes unravel enigmas of every conceivable nature, from poisonings of the most intricate subtlety to the cunning theft of priceless gems. This mystery seemed infused with an almost theatrical quality, the kind that suggested intelligence and intent far beyond ordinary criminality. Our journey to Westminster was punctuated by the usual rhythm of London life. Hansom cabs rattling over cobbled streets, carriage horses snorting and stamping in impatience, the cries of costermongers offering wares at shrill intervals. Holmes remained silent for the most part, though I occasionally caught him observing a detail I would have entirely overlooked. A muddy mark on a passerby's cuff, a peculiar alignment of a chimney, or a faint trace of ash along a doorstep. Upon our arrival at Chesham Place, we were greeted once again by the sombre butler, whose composure seemed even more rigid than the evening prior. He led us through the familiar corridors, the ancestral portraits peering down, as if to pass judgment upon our intrusion. Holmes's eyes flickered momentarily to each canvas, not in idle curiosity, but with an exacting scrutiny that always suggested some hidden information might reside in the brushstrokes or the frame's age. "Observe, Watson," he murmured under his breath as we entered the hall. "The dust upon the ledge, unevenly disturbed. The left side has been brushed within the last 24 hours, while the right retains its settled accumulation. A habit perhaps of the household, or an attempt at concealment. Either is a clue." I made a mental note, scribbling furiously in my notebook. Holmes's attention to detail was always astonishing, yet even I could not predict the direction he would pursue in unravelling a case. Mr. Thorne received us with a palpable tension. "I trust you have rested well?" he asked, though his hands betrayed his anxiety, fingers drumming a silent rhythm upon the armrest of his chair. "The phenomenon occurred again last night." Holmes inclined his head. "Describe, if you would, with precise attention to timing and sequence. Every detail, Mr. Thorne, may prove of consequence." Thorne swallowed, then spoke deliberately. "It began precisely at 11:55, as before. The clock struck, yet emitted no sound. At midnight the soundless chime returned, and as always, immediately thereafter, the footsteps began. They paced across the ceiling above the hall, pacing as if in a measured, deliberate rhythm. I verified the rooms above. No one was present." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Measured rhythm, you say? Step cadence constant. No acceleration or irregularity." "Exactly so," Thorne replied, as if the very floorboards had a mind of their own, keeping time with some unseen metronome. Holmes rose, moving toward the hall with the decisive stride of a man who already knew where to look. I followed, my pulse quickening in anticipation. He examined the great clock first, A magnificent timepiece, its mahogany frame carved with intricate designs of flora and beasts, its pendulum swung with the grace of a practiced dancer, the hands steady and precise. Holmes, however, paid little attention to the obvious craftsmanship. Instead, he knelt and inspected the base, the mechanism, even the floor beneath it. "Curious," he murmured. "Notice, Watson, the faint impressions in the dust near the clock's left side. Footprints, yet not ordinary ones. Small, narrow, and precise, almost imperceptible, unless one is attuned to minute irregularities in a surface. They lead away from the clock toward the corridor." I leaned closer. "But surely these are from servants," I suggested, though my voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Holmes shook his head. "A logical supposition, but not borne out by evidence. The tread lacks the usual variation. No sign of a heel scraping or sole wear typical of frequent passage. And the spacing, judged against the room's length, corresponds to an individual of decidedly small stature and remarkable control. Note also the absence of other prints. One individual moves with the precision of a practiced infiltrator, or perhaps someone whose very movements are rehearsed for silence and efficiency." We proceeded to the staircase, Holmes pausing to lift the carpet runner at the base. A thin layer of dust had collected there, only partially disturbed. He gestured for me to observe the pattern. "This is crucial, Watson. The pattern of disruption suggests not merely traversal of the hall, but repeated pacing along a single trajectory. The footsteps above are not random. They follow a calculated rhythm, consistent with the strikes of the clock. Whoever or whatever moves above is marking time." The observation struck me with a peculiar thrill. "So you believe this to be deliberate, then?" Holmes nodded, the tip of his finger tracing an invisible line in the dust. "I do, and I suspect, Watson, that it is not merely to terrify Mr. Thorne. There is purpose here, a logic that will become apparent in due course. But we must observe, and with great care." Holmes turned his attention to the ceiling itself, the ornate plasterwork marred by hairline fissures that ran along the joints between panels. He tapped lightly with a small tool he carried, one of his many pocket instruments, and the hollow sound returned a peculiar resonance. Voices, movement, a subtle hollow space, perhaps used in construction to convey sound differently. Ingenious in a macabre fashion. The ceiling itself may be amplifying or transmitting footsteps in a manner designed to confuse and alarm. I could not conceal my amazement. Holmes's mind leapt over possibilities with astonishing fluidity, rendering the seemingly supernatural into a series of logical possibilities, each more precise than the last. "You mean the floorboards above are not directly overhead, or the sound has been altered?" "Precisely, Watson. And yet," he added with a hint of amusement, "this is only the beginning. Observe the clock more closely." He returned to the timepiece, opening its case with deft fingers. The inner workings were immaculate, yet Holmes's attention was drawn not to the mechanics, but to a tiny, almost invisible scratch near the base of the pendulum's support. He tapped it lightly with his tool. "A mark," he muttered, "consistent with a tool of considerable precision. Someone has interfaced with this mechanism in such a way as to mute the chimes selectively. Ingenious, again, yet deliberate. I felt a chill. The case was no mere curiosity. It was the work of an intellect precise enough to control sound, timing, and perception." Holmes's eyes finally met mine, sharp and penetrating. "We shall stay here tonight, Watson. I wish to witness the phenomenon firsthand. The steps, the muted strikes, all of it. Observation will clarify what speculation cannot. Meanwhile, we must prepare. Question the staff. Examine the upper rooms, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, discern the method and purpose behind this curious arrangement." As the day drew on, I busied myself with note-taking, assisting the household with queries that Holmes directed with his characteristic precision. And when evening fell, London's fog pressing against the tall windows of Chesham Place, I realized that we were about to witness a display of cunning so meticulous that even the rational mind might waver at the spectacle. Holmes, meanwhile, remained serene, almost impatient in his quiet anticipation. He would not reveal his thoughts, of course, not yet. But I knew with certainty that the hours ahead would mark the beginning of an investigation that would test every faculty of observation, deduction, and courage we possessed. For in the silent strikes of a clock, in the footsteps above an empty hall, there lay a mystery of purpose, and a mind behind it that rivaled even that of Sherlock Holmes himself. Night had fully descended upon London when Holmes and I settled into Chesham Place once more, the city outside swallowed by a dense, suffocating fog that rendered the street lamps into pale, trembling sentinels. Inside, the household was hushed, every creak and murmur amplified by the oppressive silence, which seemed almost conspiratorial, as though the house itself were aware of our intent. Holmes moved through the rooms with a purposeful grace, his eyes scanning for the minutest irregularities, while I followed obediently, my notebook at the ready, recording every observation with as much clarity as my excitement would allow. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered, his finger tracing a hairline fissure in the wall near the staircase. "This crack is not natural. Its width varies in a manner that suggests expansion and contraction, possibly a result of sustained pressure or vibration. If our intruder or observer employs the ceiling or walls to transmit sound, these small imperfections may play a vital role." I glanced at him, marvelling as always at his ability to draw extraordinary inferences from ordinary details. "So you suspect the footsteps above are more than mere haunting, Holmes?" "Precisely, and we shall soon know if this suspicion is founded." Holmes had requested that the household staff remain within earshot, and the servants had complied with varying degrees of reluctance. We began with the butler, a tall, stoic man named Graves, who had remained composed since our arrival, yet whose knuckles betrayed a subtle tension when he clasped his hands before him. "Mr. Graves," Holmes began, voice courteous yet firm, "I wish for you to recount in your own words exactly what you have observed during the episodes of the silent clock strikes. No detail is too minor." Graves cleared his throat. "Sir, as you know, the first occurrence was last evening. I was making my rounds through the upper rooms, as is my duty, and at precisely 11:55 I heard the clock strike. At first I thought the mechanism had failed. Then the footsteps began. I moved through the house, checking each room. None were occupied. Nothing was amiss." Holmes tilted his head, his gaze fixed upon Graves with an intensity that made the man shiver. "And these steps, describe them." "Measured, sir, as if pacing someone tall. They begin over the hall, then move toward the north wing, stop, then return in the same rhythm. I cannot explain it." Holmes's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Very good. Your honesty is appreciated. Now, Watson, we shall speak with the maid, Miss Eleanor Finch." Miss Finch was a young woman of delicate build, with eyes wide and haunted. She seemed reluctant to speak at first, yet Holmes's calm presence encouraged her confidence. I never leave my post during the evening hours, sir," she began. "Yet I hear them, footsteps always pacing above the hall, and sometimes I hear whispers, faint, almost like someone speaking behind a thick curtain." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Whispers, you say?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, almost as if the ceiling itself were speaking. and I could catch fragments of words, but never the full sentence. Holmes steepled his fingers. A sign I knew all too well indicated that his mind was racing through permutations. Interesting. Very well, we shall observe this directly tonight. Watson, prepare yourself for the unexpected. What we hear may appear supernatural, yet every phenomenon, no matter how strange, obeys the laws of reason. As night deepened, we stationed ourselves in the hall beneath the great clock, Holmes placing his keen gaze upon the ceiling, while I attempted to record every detail with careful precision. The clock ticked on, each swing of its pendulum a hypnotic metronome that seemed to accentuate the tension in the room. At precisely 11:55, the first chime rang out, or rather, failed to ring. The hands of the clock moved as expected, yet there was no sound, not a single note. I glanced at Holmes. His expression remained calm, almost expectant, yet his eyes shone with that unmistakable glint of anticipation. And then it began. The footsteps, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but steadily growing more distinct. They traced a measured rhythm across the ceiling above us, pacing with a precision that defied natural explanation. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the sound approached, halted, and then returned in the same haunting cadence. "Note the timing, Watson," Holmes murmured. "They are synchronized with the clock. See how the steps begin immediately after each silent strike. There is no randomness here. The perpetrator, if one exists, is using the clock to mark intervals, or perhaps to maintain a constant rhythm." I nodded, though my own thoughts were tangled with unease. The very notion of someone orchestrating such a precise phenomenon seemed fantastical, yet Holmes's calm assurance was contagious. As the night wore on, we observed a second anomaly. A faint, barely audible whisper, drifting through the hall like smoke. I leaned forward, straining to catch the words, but they eluded comprehension. Holmes, however, seemed untroubled. He merely made a note on a small pad, his pen moving with swift, deliberate strokes. "Curious," he murmured, his voice low and reflective. "The whispers do not correspond to human speech patterns entirely. There is modulation, a cadence, perhaps even mechanical amplification. Watson, mark my words, this is no mere ghost story. The method here is ingenious, and our task is to uncover it before it escalates." Hours passed, and yet the steps and silent strikes continued, a relentless pattern that seemed to bind the very air of the house in suspense. We spoke with other staff members, each recounting variations upon the theme. Some noting that the steps varied in intensity, others insisting they could sense the presence of something or someone, yet never could they identify the source. Holmes listened, asked precise questions, and occasionally glanced at me with a knowing look, as if to remind me that observation, not conjecture, would yield the answers. By the time the first tendrils of dawn crept through the foggy windows, we had amassed a wealth of observations, the peculiar dust patterns, the silent strikes, the cadence of the footsteps, the faint whispers, and the consistent timing. Each piece seemed, on its own, insufficient to explain the phenomenon, yet when combined, a pattern began to emerge, a hidden logic beneath what appeared to be chaos. Holmes rose, stretching with deliberate grace. "Watson, I am convinced we have the foundation for a breakthrough. The next steps require patience, precision, and subtlety. We shall need to inspect the upper rooms directly, perhaps even the construction of the ceiling itself. And I suspect, Watson, that the key will lie not in what is present, but in what is deliberately absent." I marvelled at his reasoning. Even in the face of what appeared supernatural, Holmes remained resolutely grounded in logic, each hypothesis built upon observation and deduction rather than fear. It was a quality that both reassured and unsettled me, for I knew that when Holmes reached the point of certainty, the solution would be as brilliant as it would be unfathomable to all but his unique intellect. Thus ended the first night of observation. The footsteps continued, the whispers persisted, and the silent clock struck in its eerie, precise manner. And yet, amid the strange and inexplicable, I felt a thrill of anticipation. The case was fully engaged, and the mind of Sherlock Holmes was already at work unravelling a mystery that would challenge the boundaries of reason itself. Little did we know, the next days would bring not only more anomalies, but also the first shadows of human treachery, an enemy not of the supernatural, but of intelligence, cunning, and purpose, and it would fall to Holmes to uncover, with all the skill and patience at his disposal, the method, the motive, and ultimately the mind behind the clock that struck alone. The following morning, the fog over London had not abated, but rather thickened, clinging stubbornly to the gaslit streets like a damp shroud. Holmes and I made our way once more to Chesham Place, the city's usual clamour muted by the heavy mist, as though the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the mysteries we were about to confront. Even as I braced myself for another night of strange phenomena, a new element had entered our investigation, one that promised or threatened to complicate matters considerably: Scotland Yard. Upon our arrival, we found that Inspector Lestrade had been dispatched in response to Mr. Thorne's urgent entreaty. The inspector, though an experienced officer, seemed ill at ease in the presence of our peculiar circumstances. He was, as ever, earnest, but inclined toward conclusions that relied more upon precedent than upon observation. "Ah, Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted, his eyes sweeping the hall with a mixture of curiosity and scepticism. "I confess, when I first received Mr. Thorne's letter, I assumed a simple prank, or perhaps some domestic disturbance. But I must admit, upon witnessing the household, I am perplexed." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze appraising Lestrade as one might a chess piece. "Inspector, we are here to resolve confusion, not exacerbate it. Pray, observe with care and restraint. Every detail is material." Lestrade gave a perfunctory nod, and we proceeded to question the staff once more. Graves, the butler, and Miss Finch, the maid, reiterated their accounts of the silent strikes and the footsteps above. Holmes observed closely, making small notations and occasionally muttering to himself. It was during this session that a new figure entered the narrative, a distant cousin of Mr. Thorne, Mr. Henry Carow, who had recently taken residence in the adjoining wing of Chesham Place. Carow was a man of imposing height and demeanour, with dark, calculating eyes and an air of confident detachment. He introduced himself politely enough, yet there was an unmistakable edge in his manner, a subtle defensiveness that did not escape Holmes's notice. "Mr. Carow," Holmes began smoothly, "I understand you have recently taken up residence nearby. Have you observed any peculiar occurrences within the household?" Carow hesitated, as though weighing his words. "I have heard unusual sounds," he admitted at last. "Footsteps at odd hours, a clock striking, yet producing no sound. Naturally, I assumed it to be nothing more than the eccentricities of Mr. Thorne's staff, or perhaps an overactive imagination." Holmes's eyes glinted with interest. "And yet you came to the house last evening. Did you, by chance, enter the hall where these phenomena are said to occur?" Carow's gaze flickered, subtle but unmistakable. Yes. I was concerned for my cousin, naturally. But I assure you, I left no mark, and my presence was minimal." Lestrade, ever eager to seize upon apparent evidence, leaned forward, Holmes, Dr. Watson, surely we have here a potential suspect. A visitor with access to the upper rooms, with motive to disturb the household, and perhaps even capable of manipulating the clock. Holmes raised a hand in a gesture of mild rebuke. Inspector, we must not allow preliminary appearances to dictate our judgment. Mr. Carrow's presence, while noteworthy, is in no way sufficient to confirm culpability. Observation, not assumption, will guide us. Nonetheless, the air of suspicion settled upon Carrow with subtle inevitability. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, and I could not help but notice a faint flush across his cheeks as he attempted to mask any sign of guilt. Yet Holmes remained impassive, his sharp gaze unbroken, as if he were absorbing every nuance of the man's behaviour for later consideration. Holmes then requested to inspect the clock more closely, and Carrow, reluctantly, acquiesced. The great timepiece, majestic and foreboding, stood as silent witness to the tension that had settled upon the hall. Holmes examined the mechanism with meticulous care, tapping lightly on various components, observing the pendulum swing, and noting the delicate scratches near its base. Carrow watched, his expression carefully neutral, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of interest, an involuntary acknowledgment of the clock's peculiarities. "Notice, Watson," Holmes whispered, bending low over the inner workings, "how the escapement mechanism has been subtly altered. The silent chimes are not a product of natural failure, but of intentional adjustment. The perpetrator possesses intimate knowledge of horology and mechanics. A person unacquainted with such devices would find it nearly impossible to execute such precision." I glanced toward Carrow, curiosity mingled with unease. Could our visitor possess such knowledge, Holmes? Holmes's lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. "It is possible, Watson, though not yet probable. Remember, intelligence is not measured by confidence alone. We must consider motive, opportunity, and skill in concert." To complicate matters further, a small anonymous note was discovered, tucked behind the clock's face, as if placed deliberately to be found. Holmes unfolded it with a delicate precision, his eyes scanning the contents. The message was brief, cryptic. The time must be marked, the steps counted, the watcher observed. Only then will the truth emerge. Lestrade frowned. Some trickster, I presume. Holmes, however, did not answer immediately. He merely studied the note, his keen mind undoubtedly passing every nuance of handwriting, word choice, and punctuation. "This is no prank," he said finally, his tone measured but firm. "The writer is knowledgeable, deliberate, and perhaps intimately familiar with the household. And yet," he paused, tapping the note with his finger, "there is subtle misdirection embedded here. The most vital clue lies not in what is written, but in what is omitted." Carrow's presence, coupled with the cryptic note, seemed to stir an immediate current of tension throughout the household. The staff whispered in corners, casting anxious glances at the adjoining wing. Lestrade, eager to act, suggested detaining Carrow for further questioning, a measure Holmes discouraged with characteristic precision. "Patience, Inspector," Holmes admonished gently. "Hasty judgment will yield only error. Observe, inquire, and deduce. Only then may the culprit be revealed with certainty. Meanwhile, Mr. Carrow is to remain under polite observation. There will be no hasty accusations in my house." As the day wore on, Holmes and I continued our meticulous examination of the hall, the clock, and the upper rooms. Holmes noted the slightest irregularities in the floorboards, the ceiling's plaster, and even the arrangement of furniture, while I recorded every detail with diligence. Carrow's occasional presence cast an additional layer of intrigue, yet Holmes remained inscrutable, his mind clearly working several steps ahead of all observers. By evening, we had gathered substantial data. The silent clock strikes, the measured footsteps, the whispers, and Caro's enigmatic behaviour. Holmes announced that we would remain in Chesham Place that night to witness the events firsthand, a decision I welcomed with equal measures of anticipation and trepidation. We prepared for the evening's vigil. I could not help but reflect upon the delicate web of observation, inference, and subtlety that Holmes had begun to weave. There was no doubt in my mind that the first suspect had emerged, yet I also knew, from countless previous cases, that Holmes's intuition would ultimately surpass any superficial evidence. The true culprit, I sensed, was still cloaked in shadows, waiting for a mind capable of deciphering the hidden pattern to bring them into the light. And so, as the fog of London pressed against the windows and the gas lamps flickered with uncertain light, we prepared for the night ahead. The footsteps would sound, the clock would strike in silence, and the mystery of Chesham Place would deepen, drawing us ever closer to a revelation that promised to astonish even the most seasoned observer. The night at Chesham Place stretched before us like a living thing, heavy with anticipation and fog that pressed against the tall windows as if trying to peer in upon our vigil. Holmes and I settled once more in the hall beneath the silent clock, our seats strategically placed to give us a full view of the upper floor. The staff had retired to their quarters, their whispers fading into uneasy quietude. Even Caro had taken a distant position, ostensibly reading by the weak light of a gas lamp, yet I could not help but feel his presence added an electric tension to the room, a subtle pressure upon the air, reminding us that observation alone was insufficient. Action must follow. Holmes, true to his habitual methods, was unusually quiet, his piercing gaze fixed on the clock and the ceiling above. He seemed almost to listen for a sound that only he could discern. I, seated nearby, attempted to steady my own racing pulse, acutely aware that the mystery was at the very edge of reason and comprehension. At precisely 11:55, the first chime occurred, or rather, failed to occur. The hands of the clock moved with mechanical precision, yet no sound accompanied their passage. The silence was palpable, pressing upon the nerves, as if the hall itself had been drained of breath. Then, almost immediately, it began. The footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate, echoing above us in the vast emptiness of the upper floors. Their cadence was meticulous, in perfect synchrony with the unseen strikes of the clock. I found myself leaning forward, straining to detect the subtlest variation in rhythm, in tone, in placement. Holmes, however, remained calm, his face a mask of concentration. Occasionally he would mutter a word under his breath, a quiet commentary upon the unfolding phenomenon that I struggled to interpret. Then, suddenly, he leaned forward and gestured for me to observe something near the base of the hall's central column. "Watson, look closely," he whispered, his hand resting upon a narrow streak of discoloration upon the polished floor. "Do you see it? Faint? Almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable if one knows to look for it." I bent low, squinting. There was indeed a subtle trace, an uneven mark in the varnish of the floor, as though some small object had been dragged across it. "A scratch?" I murmured. Holmes shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. "Not a scratch, Watson. A track, small, deliberate, and most importantly, directional. Observe the trajectory. It begins near the clock, curves subtly along the hall, and terminates beneath the base of the staircase. The implications are significant. Whoever manipulates the clock's chimes is also orchestrating these steps. And there," he added, tapping a finger upon a shadowed corner, is the first tangible clue to the method behind the mystery. My mind reeled with possibilities. Silent strikes, measured footsteps, and now a physical mark. Deliberate, precise, and entirely human in origin. Yet the stairs above remained empty. Caro at a distance, and the staff, as far as we could discern, in their own quarters. The enigma deepened, but at last we had a foothold in the tangible world. Holmes crouched to inspect the mark more closely, producing a magnifying glass from his coat pocket. Note, Watson, the compression along the surface. A small weight, applied consistently, has pressed upon the floor in this pattern. And notice, he continued, tapping gently near the clock's base, the pendulum rod bears a faint indentation, hardly perceptible, yet perfectly aligned with the initial stroke of the chime. Someone has interfaced directly with the mechanism, altering the sound while simultaneously coordinating movement across the hall. The ingenuity is admirable in a perverse sort of way. I found myself both awed and uneasy. The precision required to execute such a feat was extraordinary, beyond the capacity of ordinary mischief. Holmes's deduction was relentless, teasing order from chaos, revealing human cunning hidden beneath what first seemed supernatural. "Holmes," I said, unable to contain my curiosity, "you believe this is the work of Caro?" Holmes's eyes met mine, sharp and calculating. "I do not yet know, Watson. Caro's proximity and timing are certainly suspicious, but suspicion alone is not proof. The true culprit must possess both knowledge of horology and an understanding of acoustic transmission. We must continue to observe, to gather further evidence, and most critically, to identify inconsistencies in the accounts of those present." As if on cue, a small sound drew my attention, a faint shuffle from the far side of the hall. I turned to see Caro glance up from his book, his expression carefully neutral, though the subtle twitch of his fingers betrayed a flicker of unease. Holmes, however, did not address him directly, content instead to return to the floor, eyes sweeping the hall as though he were reading the very structure for hidden patterns. "Watson, there is something more here," he murmured quietly. "Consider the footsteps. They are consistent, yes, yet not entirely so. Some strikes bear a slightly heavier weight, others are almost imperceptible. There is a rhythm, yes, but within that rhythm are deliberate variations. These variations, they mark time differently, almost as if to signal intervals, or perhaps to encode a message of some kind." I found my pulse quickening. The implications were staggering. Not merely a silent clock and disembodied footsteps, but encoded signals, deliberate communication through rhythm and sound. The method of madness revealed itself in glimpses, tantalizingly close, yet still veiled. Holmes rose suddenly, straightening with his usual brisk authority. "Watson, the hidden clue is this. The solution does not lie merely in observation of the phenomena, but in the gaps, the spaces between, the intervals where attention falters. One who understands silence as well as sound wields control far more profound than brute force. And in this case, control is precisely what has been exerted." I could hardly suppress a shiver. The night had yielded the first solid evidence. A physical mark, a faint trace of manipulation. But Holmes's insight suggested that the heart of the mystery was still concealed, deliberately masked by the clever orchestration of silence and sound. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the fog-shrouded windows, we had amassed a wealth of observations. The silent clock strikes, the measured footsteps, the faint scratch on the hall floor, and the subtle variations in rhythm that hinted at deliberate design. Holmes, as always, remained composed, almost serene. though his mind was clearly working at a pace I could scarcely comprehend. "Watson," he said finally, as we prepared to take a brief respite before the evening's renewed observation, "we have the first clue, subtle but unmistakable. It is a thread, fine, delicate, easily overlooked. But if we follow it, I believe we shall soon unravel the greater tapestry. The method, the mind, and ultimately the motive are within reach. Patience and vigilance, Watson. All shall be revealed in due course." As we left the hall to rest, I could not help but reflect upon the remarkable skill required to orchestrate such an enigma. The footsteps, the clock, the faint scratches, all pointed to a mind that was precise, deliberate, and frighteningly clever. And Holmes, with his characteristic patience and insight, had already begun to untangle the first threads of a mystery that promised to confound and captivate in equal measure. The following evening at Chesham Place began with a quiet unease that seemed to settle over the household, as surely as the fog that pressed against the windows. Holmes and I returned well before nightfall, determined to witness the strange phenomena firsthand. Our vigil had already revealed the first hidden clue, the subtle scratch across the hall floor. But it was clear that the puzzle had further layers, and that the perpetrator's ingenuity had not yet run its course. The staff moved about with an unusual degree of nervousness, their whispered consultations punctuated by glances toward the upper floor. Mr. Thorne, for his part, seemed tense but resolute, determined to maintain the appearance of normalcy even as shadows of fear flickered in his eyes. Holmes, however, was as composed as ever, his attention fully focused upon observation and deduction, the slightest hint of excitement glimmering in his eyes. Shortly after nightfall, as we settled in the hall beneath the silent clock, Holmes turned to me with a subtle gesture. "Watson, note the intervals, observe the changes in cadence, and watch carefully the points at which attention lapses in the household. These are precisely the moments when our intruder may act most freely." We had scarcely spoken when the first silent strike occurred, 11:55, followed immediately by the familiar footsteps. This time, however, something was different. Midway through the rhythm, a muffled sound, a faint scuffle, emanated from the north wing. I leaned forward instinctively, heart quickening, and Holmes's sharp eyes followed mine. "Interesting," he murmured. "The sequence has been interrupted deliberately. Someone has altered the rhythm. That, Watson, is a new development." We rose cautiously, Holmes moving with practiced stealth toward the corridor that led to the upper rooms. I followed, trying to suppress the nervous tension that threatened to betray my awareness of the strange echoes. As we approached the north wing, we heard a more distinct sound, a door opening and closing, but with such delicacy that it might have been mistaken for a floorboard settling. Holmes held up a hand, signalling silence, then advanced a few steps before crouching near the base of the door. "It seems we have a second incident tonight," he said softly. "Observe the subtle disarray. The rug has been shifted, just enough to leave a faint impression on the floor beneath. The perpetrator moves with extraordinary care, yet even the most meticulous habits leave a trace. Watch, Watson, for the hidden movements." We entered the room quietly, and there, lying on the floor, was a small object, a silver locket belonging to Miss Finch, the maid. She had left it on a side table earlier in the day, and its displacement confirmed that someone had been inside the room while the household believed it to be undisturbed. Holmes crouched and examined the locket, noting fingerprints and subtle smudges. "Clearly, our intruder is not merely creating an illusion," Holmes observed, his tone calm yet precise. "There is intent here, an object taken or moved deliberately, while the larger spectacle, the silent strikes and footsteps, serves as misdirection. The rhythm of fear is as calculated as the rhythm of sound. I glanced at Holmes, astounded. So the silent strikes are not the main event. They are a distraction. Exactly, Watson, he replied. The misdirection draws attention to the supernatural, away from the practical, tangible acts that occur simultaneously. Our task is to separate the spectacle from reality, to observe what is moved and what is staged. As we exited the room, Holmes directed me to follow him to the stairwell. We ascended cautiously, noting each irregularity. A scuffed banister, a faint smear on the wall, subtle depressions in the carpet that suggested careful pacing. Above us the floorboards remained undisturbed, yet the echoes of the hall below carried the familiar rhythm of footsteps. Seemingly above and around us, an auditory labyrinth designed to confuse. Watson! The skill required here is extraordinary, Holmes whispered. Our intruder understands both mechanics and human perception. The timing of each step, each silent strike, is calculated to exploit expectation, to manipulate fear and attention. Note, too, the intervals of inaction. These are as deliberate as action itself. We paused in the upper corridor to inspect a small panel in the ceiling, which Holmes had noticed on the previous day. With practised fingers, he lifted it slightly, revealing a narrow cavity above the hall. Within, faint dust patterns suggested the passage of a small, deliberate object, or perhaps a person, without leaving conventional traces. Holmes' eyes gleamed with excitement. Here, Watson, lies the key to the footsteps. Observe the slight hollow, the way sound would be conducted, the natural amplification through the cavity. Whoever designed this knew the physics of sound well, and has used it to terrifying effect. The entire house has become an instrument, with invisible performers orchestrating fear. Our investigation, however, was interrupted by a sudden, startling occurrence. A muffled scream emanated from the drawing-room below, followed by hurried footsteps. We rushed down to find Miss Finch standing pale and trembling, pointing toward the library. The clock. It struck, and then I saw shadows moving, she stammered. Holmes placed a calm hand upon her shoulder. Miss Finch, breathe. We shall ascertain the facts. Shadows are rarely the sole evidence of culpability. Perception may be deceived when fear dominates. We entered the library carefully. The room appeared undisturbed, yet Holmes's sharp eyes immediately noted a detail I had missed. A book, previously aligned with its neighbours, had been shifted slightly, revealing a faint mark on the shelf beneath. Holmes leaned forward, examining it with his magnifying glass. A delicate trace, Watson. Someone has been here, perhaps to leave a message, or to test our vigilance. The precision? Remarkable. The crescendo of these events, the displaced locket, the shifted book, the hollow ceiling, and the invisible footsteps, had begun to exert a tangible weight upon the household. Even Caro, ever composed, seemed slightly unsettled, though he remained outwardly calm. Holmes, however, was invigorated, his mind weaving the threads of observation into a cohesive pattern. "Watson," he said quietly as we returned to our vigil position beneath the hall clock, "the rising tension serves a purpose beyond mere dramatics. Our intruder understands that fear sharpens observation, but also clouds judgment. Each step, each silent chime, each shadow and misplacement is a calculated signal. If we remain patient, the pattern will reveal itself, and from that pattern we shall deduce the method and ultimately the mind behind it." The remainder of the night passed in intense observation. Every minute nuance, the faintest scrape, the smallest alteration in rhythm, the subtlest shift in light and shadow, was catalogued meticulously. Holmes's patience and intellect illuminated what appeared at first as chaos, and I, loyal chronicler, recorded each discovery with meticulous care. By the first light of dawn, we had gathered an unprecedented wealth of information. The silent strikes, the measured footsteps, the faint traces of movement, and now tangible evidence of intrusion. The case was no longer a mere curiosity. It was a carefully orchestrated display of intellect, timing, and deliberate misdirection. And Holmes, as always, was already several steps ahead, anticipating the next movement in a game whose rules were visible only to him. As we left Chesham Place that morning, I could not help but feel the thrill of a case that was rapidly unfolding into something extraordinary. The footsteps, the clock, and the hidden traces were no longer isolated anomalies. They were threads of a grand design, and I knew with growing certainty that the true measure of our intruder's genius, and perhaps danger, had yet to be fully revealed. By the 7th evening of our vigil at Chesham Place, the fog over London had taken on a particularly oppressive quality, suffusing the streets and the house itself with a thick, clammy air that seemed to settle into the very bones. Holmes and I had grown accustomed to the strange rhythm of the silent strikes, the measured footsteps, and the cryptic traces of movement throughout the hall and upper rooms. Yet each day brought fresh nuance and subtlety to the puzzle. That evening, Lestrade had returned with a team of officers, eager to establish some semblance of control over a case that had, to their minds, grown more surreal than ordinary detective work could accommodate. Their arrival, though well-intentioned, immediately introduced confusion, as each officer brought their own assumptions and preconceptions, eager to assign blame, often prematurely, based on the most superficial of observations. Holmes, Lestrade began, a note of impatience in his voice. Surely we must apprehend someone. Mr. Carrow's presence remains suspicious. We know he has access to the upper rooms, and he was near the clock last night when the footsteps began. Holmes inclined his head in polite acknowledgment, but remained silent. I noted, as always, the careful restraint in his demeanour, never hasty, never prone to conjecture without evidence. The first misdirection arose almost immediately. One of the officers, examining the hall floor, noticed a small dark smudge near the base of the stairs. "See here," he declared, "a footprint! Surely this confirms an intruder's presence." Holmes bent low, inspecting the mark with his magnifying glass. "A logical assumption, Inspector, yet not entirely correct," he said calmly. "Notice the shape, narrow, elongated, with a slight arching along the inner sole. Compare it to standard measurements of Mr. Carrow's boots, or indeed the staff's shoes. It does not match either. In fact, it is likely artificial, intended to mislead." Lestrade frowned, clearly frustrated. Artificial? Why would someone go to such lengths? Holmes allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "Misdirection, my dear Inspector. Our intruder has anticipated observation and has crafted a false trail to divert attention. The genius of this case lies in the interplay between reality and illusion. One must question everything, even what seems most obvious." As the evening progressed, further anomalies compounded the confusion. A series of shadows flickered across the hall as lanterns swayed, creating the illusion of figures passing overhead. Several officers, startled by these illusions, insisted upon inspecting the upper rooms, reporting seeing fleeting movements. Carrow, too, was observed by some as seemingly lingering near the hall, though Holmes quickly noted discrepancies in timing and spatial observation. "See, Watson," Holmes murmured quietly, as we observed the officer's futile searches. "This is precisely why misdirection is effective. The human mind struggles to separate suggestion from fact, particularly under duress. Our intruder exploits perception, turning expectation into error. Each false lead is designed to scatter attention and conceal the true method. The household staff, already on edge from the previous incidents, became increasingly nervous. Miss Finch reported that she heard the familiar whispers above the hall once more, though this time their words seemed to hint at someone she did not recognize. Graves, the butler, noticed faint marks on the dining table, suggesting another unseen visit. These subtle manipulations were undoubtedly deliberate, calculated to create a sense of chaos, while the real actions remained hidden. Holmes, for his part, remained a pillar of calm, moving silently through the hall and corridors, observing minutiae unnoticed by others. "The misdirection is layered," he explained softly to me. "Footsteps, shadows, whispers, displaced objects, each a red herring in itself, yet together forming a symphony designed to obscure the truth. Our task is to pass signal from noise, reality from artifice." It was during this period of intense observation that Holmes made a discovery both subtle and crucial. A small mark on the underside of the hall railing, scarcely visible to the untrained eye, suggested the movement of a lightweight mechanism. A pulley or guide of some sort, perhaps used to direct an object or transmit vibration. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest as he traced the faint scratches, his fingers careful not to disturb them. "Watson, note this," he whispered. "This is the kind of clue designed to remain hidden amidst chaos. It is not meant to attract attention, yet it will ultimately lead us to the method employed. Observe the precision of the marks, the way they align with the intervals of the silent strikes. Our intruder is nothing if not meticulous." Meanwhile, the officers continued to pursue false leads. They inspected Carrow's quarters, questioning his movements, and even attempted to trace the supposed intruder through the hall using rudimentary observations. Each of their efforts yielded nothing of substance, and yet the atmosphere of suspicion grew heavier, as if the house itself were conspiring against them. Holmes leaned back in his chair for a moment, his eyes scanning the hall once more. "Misdirection is the art of manipulating perception," he murmured, "and in this case the artist is highly skilled. Observe how every element, the shadows, the whispers, the displaced objects, draws attention to what is superficial, while the true actions remain concealed. Only by focusing on consistency, pattern, and the subtle anomalies will we reach the solution." As midnight approached, the silent strikes commenced, followed by the familiar footsteps above. The pattern was familiar, yet I could not shake a growing sense of unease, for the intruder seemed to have escalated their efforts. A faint metallic sound, a click or scrape, echoed above the hall, distinct from previous occurrences, suggesting that the hidden mechanism had been adjusted or tampered with. Holmes noticed it instantly. "Watson," he said quietly, "pay attention to the intervals. The cadence has been altered, subtle though it may be. This is deliberate, intended to create confusion, to make us question our observations. Yet every change is an opportunity. The more intricate the misdirection, the clearer the method will become to those patient enough to observe." I watched, fascinated, as Holmes traced every nuance, the pauses in the footsteps, the altered rhythm, the minute shifts in shadow and light. He recorded his deductions meticulously, anticipating the next stage of the intruder's design with uncanny precision. By the time the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the fogged windows, we had gathered more evidence than any observer could have anticipated. The altered intervals of footsteps, the faint mechanism marks, and the layered misdirection intended to obscure every tangible clue. Holmes, ever composed, remained confident that the solution was within reach, even as the web of misdirection threatened to confound those less trained in the art of deduction. "Watson," he said at last, voice calm but firm, "the rising tension and deliberate confusion serve a singular purpose: to divert attention from the truth. Our intruder's skill is extraordinary, but we are patient. We observe, we compare, and we shall deduce. Every false lead is a step toward revelation, provided one knows where to look." As we left Chesham Place that morning, I reflected on the extraordinary subtlety of the misdirection we had witnessed. Shadows, whispers, false impressions, they were all part of a deliberate scheme to obscure the real movements and intentions behind the phenomenon. And I knew with absolute certainty that Holmes, with his unmatched intellect and unerring patience, would unravel it completely. The fog lay heavy over London once more, blanketing the city in a damp, pallid grey that seemed almost to echo the unease at Chesham Place. Holmes, as always, greeted the day with his usual energy, pacing the sitting-room with a precision that betrayed the wheels turning in his mind. I observed him with a mixture of admiration and mild apprehension, knowing that the next phase of the investigation would demand ingenuity, subtlety, and risk. "The time has come, Watson," he announced abruptly, pausing mid-stride. "We shall set a trap, not of brute force, nor of overt confrontation, but one of intellect and observation. The intruder's skill is extraordinary, yet every skill contains limitations, flaws that reveal themselves under pressure. We shall find them." I rose, attempting to mask my excitement. "A trap, Holmes? Do you mean to provoke them? Perhaps lure them into a mistake?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. Our intruder thrives on misdirection and carefully measured intervals. If we manipulate the conditions subtly, we may induce an error, however slight, that exposes both method and motive. Observation alone will not suffice. We must become participants in the orchestration itself." His plan, as he explained it, was elegant in its simplicity and diabolical in execution. That evening, Holmes requested that the household maintain the usual routines, while he and I took a position not directly beneath the hall clock, but in the library, affording a partial view of both the hall and the stairwell. A small mirror positioned at an angle would allow us to observe the upper rooms while remaining unseen. "Watson," he said, lowering his voice, "the trick is to appear unaware, to allow the intruder to operate with confidence, while all the while we record every movement, every shift, every pattern. Note that the misdirection relies heavily on predictability. If we alter that predictability subtly, we force a reaction. That reaction, however small, will provide the key." I followed his instructions meticulously, settling into position and noting each detail. The faint scratch along the hall floor, the precise intervals of the silent strikes, and the whisper-like echoes that seemed to drift from the upper rooms. Holmes, for his part, had prepared a small device, a rudimentary noise amplifier, designed to detect minute variations in sound from above. With it, we could identify subtle differences in step weight and cadence, invisible to the naked ear. As the hour approached 11:55, I could feel a tense anticipation pressing upon the room. Holmes remained calm, serene almost, yet I could detect the intense focus in the slight narrowing of his eyes. The clock's minute hand approached its predetermined mark, and the familiar silence descended in its wake. Then the footsteps began, slow, measured, deliberate. The same rhythm as previous nights, yet tonight they seemed slightly more confident, almost taunting. Holmes adjusted the amplifier, his fingers deftly turning dials and noting fluctuations in the sound. "Observe carefully, Watson," he whispered. "There, did you catch that? A slight hesitation between the third and fourth steps. Deliberate but imperfect. The intruder has not accounted for the possibility of continuous observation." I leaned forward, straining to hear, and indeed a subtle irregularity revealed itself. One footfall was slightly heavier than the others, creating a rhythm disruption that, to an untrained observer, would be dismissed as coincidence. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Perfect," he murmured. "The method is exposed in imperfection. Now we must proceed carefully. The intruder will attempt to maintain composure, yet the disruption of expectation may provoke further evidence." Minutes passed, the tension in the hall thickening with each silent tick of the clock. Then, a faint metallic click echoed from the upper floor. A mechanism, clearly manipulated, responding to the altered rhythm below. Holmes's gaze followed the source with surgical precision. "Watson," he said quietly, "the trap works. The intruder is engaging the mechanism, unaware that we now observe its action. We must wait until the sequence reaches its apex, for a premature reveal could ruin the entire plan." I watched in fascination as Holmes's strategy unfolded. His understanding of human psychology, combined with his mastery of observation and deduction, allowed him to manipulate the environment subtly, forcing the hidden hand to reveal itself without direct confrontation. Every pause, every shift in sound, every misstep was noted, catalogued, and understood in real time. As the sequence repeated, a subtle change occurred. The intruder, whomever they were, attempted to adjust the clock's mechanism while simultaneously maintaining the step's rhythm. In doing so, they introduced a tiny deviation, almost imperceptible, yet immediately detectable by Holmes's amplifier and my own careful observation. "Now, Watson," he whispered, his voice taut with anticipation, "observe the shadow beneath the north wing staircase. There. It moves independently of our misdirection. The intruder is compelled to act, revealing position, intent, and method. Mark my words, the truth will emerge before the next strike." I leaned forward, heart pounding, as a shadow flitted across the hall floor, distinct from the natural play of light and the usual misdirection. Holmes' eyes followed it with precision. "There," he said quietly, "the first glimpse of reality through layers of illusion. Note the weight, the cadence, the interaction with the mechanism. We shall have our answers soon." For the next several minutes we observed in silence, cataloguing every motion. The intruder, evidently skilled in both mechanics and subterfuge, attempted to maintain composure while responding to the unexpected pressure created by Holmes's subtle interference. Each adjustment, each step, betrayed knowledge and intent. Finally, Holmes leaned back, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Watson, the plan has borne fruit. We have forced the intruder to act outside of their anticipated sequence. Every movement, every subtle error, every interaction with the hall and mechanism has provided evidence. All that remains is to interpret it fully and confirm our deduction." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly, though the excitement and awe remained. Holmes, calm and methodical as ever, had orchestrated a psychological and strategic trap of extraordinary subtlety. By manipulating expectation, by observing with relentless precision, and by forcing the intruder into revealing behavior, he had brought us closer than ever to unraveling the enigma of the clock that struck alone. As we withdrew to consider the next stage of action, I reflected upon Holmes's ingenuity. The method of the intruder was intricate. Yet even the most brilliant deception could not withstand the disciplined observation and strategic intervention of a mind such as his. The night had confirmed it. The trap was set. The intruder had revealed themselves in shadow and misstep, and the final act of revelation was fast approaching. The morning after our carefully orchestrated vigil, Chesham Place was suffused with a peculiar quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, aware that a turning point in the mystery had arrived. Holmes, as usual, had begun the day with meticulous preparation. Papers arranged, notes annotated, and diagrams of the hall, clock, and upper rooms spread across the table. He moved with the calm certainty of a man who knew that the hour of revelation was at hand. I found him already inspecting the hall, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the faint scratches and indentations we had recorded the previous night. His eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. The minutest scuff of a boot, the smallest displacement of dust, each a vital piece of the puzzle. "Watson," he said without looking up, "the time has come to bring our observations together. Every minute detail from the previous evenings, every false step, every misdirection, must be understood in context. Only then can we illuminate the method and ultimately the mind behind this extraordinary orchestration." I nodded, my notebook ready. Holmes's calm authority always inspired both awe and a sense of duty. Today, we would confront the culmination of weeks of observation, misdirection, and painstaking deduction. He instructed the household, including Mr. Thorne, Miss Finch, and even the distant cousin, Mr. Carrow, to assemble in the hall. Lestrade and his officers, eager to witness the final act of discovery, joined as well. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Every individual seemed keenly aware that the resolution of the strange phenomena was imminent. Holmes began with a demonstration. "Observe," he said, lifting a small lever hidden behind the base of the clock. At once, a sequence of faint mechanical sounds echoed through the hall. Strikes, clicks, and vibrations, precisely timed to simulate the silent chimes and footsteps we had recorded. The household leaned forward in astonishment as the mechanism reproduced the auditory illusions that had confounded us for weeks. The clock, ladies and gentlemen, was never silent by accident, Holmes continued, his voice measured and precise. Its mechanism was deliberately adjusted to produce the appearance of silence, while vibrations transmitted through the floor and ceiling created the illusion of footsteps above. Every movement, every echo, was orchestrated with meticulous care, designed to manipulate perception and provoke fear. I watched the reactions carefully. Miss Finch's eyes widened with astonishment, while Mr. Thorne's jaw tightened, a mix of relief and lingering unease evident. Carrow, however, remained composed, though a faint flicker of apprehension crossed his otherwise inscrutable expression. Holmes then turned to the faint scratches and marks we had observed. "These subtle traces," he said, pointing to the floor and stairwell, "indicate deliberate interaction with the mechanism and the environment. They are consistent with precise, repeated movements, calculated to reinforce the auditory illusion. The intruder understood both human perception and mechanical engineering. A rare combination indeed." Lestrade, ever eager to assign blame, cleared his throat. "Holmes, surely this proves our cousin Carrow is involved." Holmes allowed a slight pause before responding, his eyes fixed on the man in question. "Inspector, appearances can be deceiving. Mr. Carrow, while present and observant, has left no tangible trace of direct interference. His movements align with those of a concerned relative, not a skilled manipulator of clockwork and sound. Carrow's relief was barely perceptible, yet Holmes did not linger on him. Instead, he directed our attention to the library and the north wing, where displaced objects, the locket, the shifted book, had suggested unauthorized activity. Holmes gestured toward the subtle marks on the furniture, the faint traces on the floor, and the impressions along the walls. These acts were not random, Holmes explained. They were intended to draw attention, to misdirect, to suggest supernatural or malevolent interference. Yet their purpose was clear. Each displacement, each anomaly, served as a distraction from the true method. By focusing on the spectacular, the observers are drawn away from the mechanics of the deception. He paused, allowing the room to absorb the explanation, before unveiling the final element of the puzzle. Holmes pointed to the ceiling panel, previously unnoticed by most. Above this hall lies the hidden cavity we observed. Through it, sound is transmitted with precision, allowing footsteps and whispers to be projected where no person treads. The misdirection is complete. Those who seek a corporeal source are invariably misled, while the true actions remain concealed. A murmur ran through the assembly. Miss Finch, recovering her composure, whispered, "It was clever, terrifyingly clever. Designed to detect minute variations in sound from above. With it, we could identify subtle differences in step weight and cadence, invisible to the naked ear." As the hour approached 11:55, I could feel a tense anticipation pressing upon the room. Holmes remained calm, serene almost, yet I could detect the intense focus in the slight narrowing of his eyes. The clock's minute hand approached its predetermined mark, and the familiar silence descended in its wake. Then the footsteps began, slow, measured, deliberate. The same rhythm as previous nights, yet tonight they seemed slightly more confident, almost taunting. Holmes adjusted the amplifier, his fingers deftly turning dials and noting fluctuations in the sound. "Observe carefully, Watson," he whispered. "There, did you catch that? A slight hesitation between the third and fourth steps. Deliberate but imperfect. The intruder has not accounted for the possibility of continuous observation." I leaned forward, straining to hear, and indeed a subtle irregularity revealed itself. One footfall was slightly heavier than the others, creating a rhythm disruption that, to an untrained observer, would be dismissed as coincidence. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Perfect," he murmured. "The method is exposed in imperfection. Now we must proceed carefully. The intruder will attempt to maintain composure, yet the disruption of expectation may provoke further evidence." Minutes passed, the tension in the hall thickening with each silent tick of the clock. Then a faint metallic click echoed from the upper floor. A mechanism, clearly manipulated, responding to the altered rhythm below. Holmes's gaze followed the source with surgical precision. "Watson," he said quietly, "the trap works. The intruder is engaging the mechanism, unaware that we now observe its action. We must wait until the sequence reaches its apex, for a premature reveal could ruin the entire plan." I watched in fascination as Holmes's strategy unfolded. His understanding of human psychology, combined with his mastery of observation and deduction, allowed him to manipulate the environment subtly, forcing the hidden hand to reveal itself without direct confrontation. Every pause, every shift in sound, every misstep was noted, catalogued, and understood in real time. As the sequence repeated, a subtle change occurred. The intruder, whomever they were, attempted to adjust the clock's mechanism while simultaneously maintaining the step's rhythm. In doing so, they introduced a tiny deviation, almost imperceptible, yet immediately detectable by Holmes's amplifier and my own careful observation. "Now, Watson," he whispered, his voice taut with anticipation, "observe the shadow beneath the north wing staircase. There. It moves independently of our misdirection. The intruder is compelled to act, revealing position, intent, and method. Mark my words, the truth will emerge before the next strike." I leaned forward, heart pounding, as a shadow flitted across the hall floor, distinct from the natural play of light and the usual misdirection. Holmes' eyes followed it with precision. "There," he said quietly, "the first glimpse of reality through layers of illusion. Note the weight, the cadence, the interaction with the mechanism. We shall have our answers soon." For the next several minutes we observed in silence, cataloguing every motion. The intruder, evidently skilled in both mechanics and subterfuge, attempted to maintain composure while responding to the unexpected pressure created by Holmes's subtle interference. Each adjustment, each step, betrayed knowledge and intent. Finally, Holmes leaned back, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Watson, the plan has borne fruit. We have forced the intruder to act outside of their anticipated sequence. Every movement, every subtle error, every interaction with the hall and mechanism has provided evidence. All that remains is to interpret it fully and confirm our deduction." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly, though the excitement and awe remained. Holmes, calm and methodical as ever, had orchestrated a psychological and strategic trap of extraordinary subtlety. By manipulating expectation, by observing with relentless precision, and by forcing the intruder into revealing behavior, he had brought us closer than ever to unraveling the enigma of the clock that struck alone. As we withdrew to consider the next stage of action, I reflected upon Holmes's ingenuity. The method of the intruder was intricate, yet even the most brilliant deception could not withstand the disciplined observation and strategic intervention of a mind such as his. The night had confirmed it. The trap was set. The intruder had revealed themselves in shadow and misstep, and the final act of revelation was fast approaching. The morning after our carefully orchestrated vigil, Chesham Place was suffused with a peculiar quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, aware that a turning point in the mystery had arrived. Holmes, as usual, had begun the day with meticulous preparation. Papers arranged, notes annotated, and diagrams of the hall, clock, and upper rooms spread across the table. He moved with the calm certainty of a man who knew that the hour of revelation was at hand. I found him already inspecting the hall, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the faint scratches and indentations we had recorded the previous night. His eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. The minutest scuff of a boot, the smallest displacement of dust, each a vital piece of the puzzle. "Watson," he said without looking up, "the time has come to bring our observations together. Every minute detail from the previous evenings, every false step, every misdirection, must be understood in context. Only then can we illuminate the method and ultimately the mind behind this extraordinary orchestration." I nodded, my notebook ready. Holmes's calm authority always inspired both awe and a sense of duty. Today, we would confront the culmination of weeks of observation, misdirection, and painstaking deduction. He instructed the household, including Mr. Thorne, Miss Finch, and even the distant cousin, Mr. Carrow, to assemble in the hall. Lestrade and his officers, eager to witness the final act of discovery, joined as well. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Every individual seemed keenly aware that the resolution of the strange phenomena was imminent. Holmes began with a demonstration. "Observe," he said, lifting a small lever hidden behind the base of the clock. At once, a sequence of faint mechanical sounds echoed through the hall. Strikes, clicks, and vibrations, precisely timed to simulate the silent chimes and footsteps we had recorded. The household leaned forward in astonishment as the mechanism reproduced the auditory illusions that had confounded us for weeks. The clock, ladies and gentlemen, was never silent by accident, Holmes continued, his voice measured and precise. Its mechanism was deliberately adjusted to produce the appearance of silence, while vibrations transmitted through the floor and ceiling created the illusion of footsteps above. Every movement, every echo, was orchestrated with meticulous care, designed to manipulate perception and provoke fear. I watched the reactions carefully. Miss Finch's eyes widened with astonishment, while Mr. Thorne's jaw tightened, a mix of relief and lingering unease evident. Caro, however, remained composed, though a faint flicker of apprehension crossed his otherwise inscrutable expression. Holmes then turned to the faint scratches and marks we had observed. "These subtle traces," he said, pointing to the floor and stairwell, "indicate deliberate interaction with the mechanism and the environment. They are consistent with precise, repeated movements, calculated to reinforce the auditory illusion." The intruder understood both human perception and mechanical engineering. A rare combination indeed. Lestrade, ever eager to assign blame, cleared his throat. "Holmes, surely this proves our cousin Caro is involved." Holmes allowed a slight pause before responding, his eyes fixed on the man in question. "Inspector, appearances can be deceiving. Mr. Caro, while present and observant, has left no tangible trace of direct interference. His movements align with those of a concerned relative, not a skilled manipulator of clockwork and sound." Caro's relief was barely perceptible, yet Holmes did not linger on him. Instead, he directed our attention to the library and the north wing, where displaced objects, the locket, the shifted book, had suggested unauthorized activity. Holmes gestured toward the subtle marks on the furniture, the faint traces on the floor, and the impressions along the walls. "These acts were not random," Holmes explained. "They were intended to draw attention, to misdirect, to suggest supernatural or malevolent interference. Yet their purpose was clear. Each displacement, each anomaly, served as a distraction from the true method. By focusing on the spectacular, the observers are drawn away from the mechanics of the deception." He paused, allowing the room to absorb the explanation, before unveiling the final element of the puzzle. Holmes pointed to the ceiling panel, previously unnoticed by most. "Above this hall lies the hidden cavity we observed. Through it, sound is transmitted with precision, allowing footsteps and whispers to be projected where no person treads. The misdirection is complete. Those who seek a corporeal source are invariably misled, while the true actions remain concealed." A murmur ran through the assembly. Miss Finch, recovering her composure, whispered, "It was clever, terrifyingly clever. Designed to detect minute variations in sound from above. With it, we could identify subtle differences in step weight and cadence, invisible to the naked ear." As the hour approached 11:55, I could feel a tense anticipation pressing upon the room. Holmes remained calm, serene almost, yet I could detect the intense focus in the slight narrowing of his eyes. The clock's minute hand approached its predetermined mark, and the familiar silence descended in its wake. Then the footsteps began, slow, measured, deliberate. The same rhythm as previous nights, yet tonight they seemed slightly more confident, almost taunting. Holmes adjusted the amplifier, his fingers deftly turning dials and noting fluctuations in the sound. "Observe carefully, Watson," he whispered. "There, did you catch that? A slight hesitation between the third and fourth steps. Deliberate but imperfect. The intruder has not accounted for the possibility of continuous observation." I leaned forward, straining to hear, and indeed a subtle irregularity revealed itself. One footfall was slightly heavier than the others, creating a rhythm disruption that, to an untrained observer, would be dismissed as coincidence. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Perfect," he murmured. "The method is exposed in imperfection. Now we must proceed carefully. The intruder will attempt to maintain composure, yet the disruption of expectation may provoke further evidence." Minutes passed, the tension in the hall thickening with each silent tick of the clock. Then a faint metallic click echoed from the upper floor. A mechanism, clearly manipulated, responding to the altered rhythm below. Holmes's gaze followed the source with surgical precision. "Watson," he said quietly, "the trap works. The intruder is engaging the mechanism, unaware that we now observe its action. We must wait until the sequence reaches its apex, for a premature reveal could ruin the entire plan." I watched in fascination as Holmes's strategy unfolded. His understanding of human psychology, combined with his mastery of observation and deduction, allowed him to manipulate the environment subtly, forcing the hidden hand to reveal itself without direct confrontation. Every pause, every shift in sound, every misstep was noted, catalogued, and understood in real time. As the sequence repeated, a subtle change occurred. The intruder, whomever they were, attempted to adjust the clock's mechanism while simultaneously maintaining the step's rhythm. In doing so, they introduced a tiny deviation, almost imperceptible, yet immediately detectable by Holmes's amplifier and my own careful observation. "Now, Watson," he whispered, his voice taut with anticipation, "observe the shadow beneath the north wing staircase. There. It moves independently of our misdirection. The intruder is compelled to act, revealing position, intent, and method. Mark my words, the truth will emerge before the next strike." I leaned forward, heart pounding, as a shadow flitted across the hall floor, distinct from the natural play of light and the usual misdirection. Holmes' eyes followed it with precision. "There," he said quietly, "the first glimpse of reality through layers of illusion. Note the weight, the cadence, the interaction with the mechanism. We shall have our answers soon." For the next several minutes we observed in silence, cataloguing every motion. The intruder, evidently skilled in both mechanics and subterfuge, attempted to maintain composure while responding to the unexpected pressure created by Holmes's subtle interference. Each adjustment, each step, betrayed knowledge and intent. Finally, Holmes leaned back, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Watson, the plan has borne fruit. We have forced the intruder to act outside of their anticipated sequence. Every movement, every subtle error, every interaction with the hall and mechanism has provided evidence. All that remains is to interpret it fully and confirm our deduction." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly, though the excitement and awe remained. Holmes, calm and methodical as ever, had orchestrated a psychological and strategic trap of extraordinary subtlety. By manipulating expectation, by observing with relentless precision, and by forcing the intruder into revealing behavior, He had brought us closer than ever to unravelling the enigma of the clock that struck alone. As we withdrew to consider the next stage of action, I reflected upon Holmes's ingenuity. The method of the intruder was intricate, yet even the most brilliant deception could not withstand the disciplined observation and strategic intervention of a mind such as his. The night had confirmed it. The trap was set. The intruder had revealed themselves in shadow and misstep, and the final act of revelation was fast approaching. The morning after our carefully orchestrated vigil, Chesham Place was suffused with a peculiar quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, aware that a turning point in the mystery had arrived. Holmes, as usual, had begun the day with meticulous preparation. Papers arranged, notes annotated, and diagrams of the hall, clock, and upper rooms spread across the table. He moved with the calm certainty of a man who knew that the hour of revelation was at hand. I found him already inspecting the hall, magnifying glass in hand, tracing the faint scratches and indentations we had recorded the previous night. His eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. The minutest scuff of a boot, the smallest displacement of dust, each a vital piece of the puzzle. "Watson," he said without looking up, "the time has come to bring our observations together. Every minute detail from the previous evenings, every false step, every misdirection, must be understood in context. Only then can we illuminate the method and ultimately the mind behind this extraordinary orchestration." I nodded, my notebook ready. Holmes's calm authority always inspired both awe and a sense of duty. Today, we would confront the culmination of weeks of observation, misdirection, and painstaking deduction. He instructed the household, including Mr. Thorne, Miss Finch, and even the distant cousin, Mr. Carrow, to assemble in the hall. Lestrade and his officers, eager to witness the final act of discovery, joined as well. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Every individual seemed keenly aware that the resolution of the strange phenomena was imminent. Holmes began with a demonstration. "Observe," he said, lifting a small lever hidden behind the base of the clock. At once, a sequence of faint mechanical sounds echoed through the hall. Strikes, clicks, and vibrations, precisely timed to simulate the silent chimes and footsteps we had recorded. The household leaned forward in astonishment as the mechanism reproduced the auditory illusions that had confounded us for weeks. The clock, ladies and gentlemen, was never silent by accident, Holmes continued, his voice measured and precise. Its mechanism was deliberately adjusted to produce the appearance of silence, while vibrations transmitted through the floor and ceiling created the illusion of footsteps above. Every movement, every echo, was orchestrated with meticulous care, designed to manipulate perception and provoke fear. I watched the reactions carefully. Miss Finch's eyes widened with astonishment, while Mr. Thorne's jaw tightened, a mix of relief and lingering unease evident. Carrow, however, remained composed, though a faint flicker of apprehension crossed his otherwise inscrutable expression. Holmes then turned to the faint scratches and marks we had observed. "These subtle traces," he said, pointing to the floor and stairwell, "indicate deliberate interaction with the mechanism and the environment. They are consistent with precise, repeated movements, calculated to reinforce the auditory illusion. The intruder understood both human perception and mechanical engineering. A rare combination indeed." Lestrade, ever eager to assign blame, cleared his throat. "Holmes, surely this proves our cousin Carrow is involved." Holmes allowed a slight pause before responding, his eyes fixed on the man in question. Inspector, appearances can be deceiving. Mr. Carrow, while present and observant, has left no tangible trace of direct interference. His movements align with those of a concerned relative, not a skilled manipulator of clockwork and sound. Carrow's relief was barely perceptible, yet Holmes did not linger on him. Instead, he directed our attention to the library and the north wing, where displaced objects, the locket, the shifted book, had suggested unauthorized activity. Holmes gestured toward the subtle marks on the furniture, the faint traces on the floor, and the impressions along the walls. These acts were not random, Holmes explained. They were intended to draw attention, to misdirect, to suggest supernatural or malevolent interference. Yet their purpose was clear. Each displacement, each anomaly, served as a distraction from the true method. By focusing on the spectacular, the observers are drawn away from the mechanics of the deception. He paused, allowing the room to absorb the explanation, before unveiling the final element of the puzzle. Holmes pointed to the ceiling panel, previously unnoticed by most. Above this hall lies the hidden cavity we observed. Through it, sound is transmitted with precision, allowing footsteps and whispers to be projected where no person treads. The misdirection is complete. Those who seek a corporeal source are invariably misled, while the true actions remain concealed. A murmur ran through the assembly. Miss Finch, recovering her composure, whispered, "It was clever, terrifyingly clever." Holmes allowed a faint smile. Indeed, genius, combined with knowledge of human psychology, can be a formidable tool. Yet even the most brilliant deception contains flaws. The subtle variation in step weight, the tiny mechanical deviations, the traces left upon the floor. All these anomalies have revealed the truth to the diligent observer. At last, Holmes turned to reveal the culprit. The mind behind this extraordinary orchestration is Mr. Alistair Wren, the clockmaker previously employed by Mr. Thorne. He alone possessed the knowledge to manipulate the mechanism with such precision, and he alone understood the acoustic properties of the hall and upper rooms. A collective gasp followed. Mr. Thorne clutched at his chest. Wren? But he seemed loyal. Holmes inclined his head. Appearances, Mr. Thorne, are often deceptive. Wren sought to demonstrate his skill, to challenge the perceptions of those around him, and to conceal his presence through misdirection. His actions were not motivated by malice alone, but by the desire to prove his ingenuity. Dangerous, certainly, but not devoid of reason. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. Where is this Wren now? Holmes's smile was subtle but assured. He was apprehended earlier this morning, attempting to adjust the hall mechanism once more. The errors induced by our observation last night led him to expose himself, providing sufficient evidence for his capture. The trap has worked precisely as intended. I felt a wave of relief sweep through me. The weeks of tension, observation, and meticulous deduction had culminated in clarity. The footsteps, the silent strikes, the whispers, the misdirection, all were accounted for. Holmes had demonstrated once again that the most confounding mysteries were rarely beyond the grasp of careful observation, logic, and patience. Holmes concluded with a philosophical note. The lesson, Watson, is this. The mind capable of extraordinary ingenuity can be both a source of fascination and a source of fear. Yet even the most intricate deception cannot withstand methodical observation and careful deduction. Truth, like sound, may be manipulated, but it cannot be entirely concealed. As the household exhaled in relief and the officers prepared to escort Mr. Wren, I reflected upon the extraordinary sequence of events. The mystery of the clock that struck alone had been intricate, disorienting, and ingenious, yet it had yielded to the relentless discipline of Holmes's intellect and the meticulous recording of subtle observation. That evening, as the fog lifted slightly and the first pale light of dawn touched the windows of Chesham Place, I knew that I had witnessed one of the most remarkable demonstrations of deduction in our careers. Holmes, as always, had solved the unsolvable, turning fear and illusion into clarity and reason, and I, loyal chronicler, could only record it faithfully, knowing that the tale would endure as a testament to the brilliance of his mind. The morning following Wren's apprehension was calm in comparison to the tumult of the previous nights, yet it carried a peculiar weight. Chesham Place, though relieved of immediate danger, remained steeped in the lingering echoes of fear and wonder. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the soot-streaked rooftops of London and the faint glimmer of the Thames in the distance. For the first time in many nights, the gas lamps appeared as mere instruments of illumination rather than accomplices in a grand deception. Holmes, as ever, rose early. He moved quietly through the hall, inspecting the clock mechanism, the floorboards, and the subtle traces that had so confounded observers for weeks. I followed him with my notebook, prepared to record every insight, every reflection, for this case would surely be remembered among our most extraordinary adventures. "Watson," he said abruptly, as we entered the hall, "observe the residual marks, the scratches, the depressions in the floor, the faint discolorations. These, though minor, reveal the mind of Wren more clearly than any confession could. He was a man who measured his steps, his actions, and even his misdirection with exacting precision. Yet even precision cannot account for observation guided by logic and patience. I knelt to inspect the floor more closely. Indeed, even after careful cleaning and the passage of time, subtle impressions remained. Holmes's claim was accurate. The traces revealed a consistent pattern of deliberate movement, evidence of an intellect both meticulous and proud of its own ingenuity. "Holmes, do you believe he intended any true harm?" I asked, mindful of the psychological terror he had imposed upon the household. Holmes shook his head. "Not truly, Watson. Wren's motivation was, above all, intellectual. He sought to demonstrate mastery of mechanics and perception, to create an illusion that would confound the ordinary mind. Fear was a byproduct, not the goal. This distinction is subtle but important. The mind capable of such innovation is rarely malevolent in the ordinary sense. It is driven by curiosity and pride." I considered his words carefully. The realization was sobering, that a mind so brilliant could so easily manipulate the perceptions of ordinary men and women was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. I had witnessed the psychological power of intellect wielded with precision, and I could not deny the thrill it had produced. Holmes, noting my reflection, smiled faintly. "And yet, Watson, observe the lessons for us. Observation, patience, and the ability to separate appearance from reality are as vital in everyday life as in extraordinary circumstances. Wren's misdirection is a reminder that perception is a delicate instrument, easily distorted when guided by expectation and fear." The household slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Mr. Thorne, though visibly shaken, moved about with the renewed confidence that the immediate danger had passed. Miss Finch busied herself with the restoration of order, carefully returning books and personal effects to their proper places. Even Caro, though no longer under suspicion, maintained a wary vigilance, likely unsettled by the psychological game he had witnessed. Holmes, however, remained unsatisfied with superficial appearances. "Watson, there is always more beneath the surface," he said quietly as we inspected the clock once more. "Even when a case appears resolved, subtleties remain, hints of character and method that escape ordinary notice. Our task is to record these details, to understand not only the mechanics of the crime, but the intellect that conceived it." I nodded, diligently recording his observations. Every adjustment to the clock, every residual mark on the floor, every hesitation in Wren's method was a testament to meticulous thought, revealing both pride and subtle hubris. The danger had been contained, but the fascination lingered. An intellectual puzzle now complete, yet leaving an indelible impression upon the mind. Holmes's reflection soon turned to broader considerations. "Watson, note this. The greatest threats often arise not from malice alone, but from intelligence unchecked by moral restraint. Wren's actions, while technically harmless in outcome, demonstrate the potential for extraordinary skill to induce fear and confusion. This is a lesson in vigilance, in the necessity of reasoning beyond surface appearances." I observed him silently, struck by the depth of his insight. It was true. In a city of fog, shadows, and gaslight, intellect could be as formidable as any weapon. Holmes' ability to anticipate, manipulate, and ultimately restore order was not merely remarkable, it was essential. As the morning progressed, I took time to interview the household members, recording their impressions of the events. Each account, when compared with our observations, reinforced the careful orchestration of Wren's design. Every misstep, every subtle error, had been exploited by Holmes to reveal the truth. The interplay of human psychology, mechanical ingenuity, and patient observation had culminated in resolution, a demonstration of deductive brilliance few could fully appreciate. Holmes, for his part, remained engaged in quiet reflection, inspecting the hall with meticulous care. "Watson, it is remarkable how small variations, so easily overlooked, can illuminate the most complex phenomena. In this case, every error, every hesitation, every subtle mark contributed to understanding. Wren's brilliance, though dangerous in potential, has been neutralized by methodical reasoning." As we prepared to depart Chesham Place, the household expressed gratitude, their relief palpable. Yet I noted the lingering awareness in their eyes, the realization that intellect, when unrestrained, could create fear as easily as any visible threat. Holmes, with his characteristic modesty, offered reassurance, emphasizing the value of careful observation, logic, and patience in the face of the extraordinary. Walking away from Chesham Place, I reflected upon the journey we had undertaken. The clock that struck alone had confounded expectation, manipulated perception, and tested our powers of observation. Yet through meticulous deduction and patient strategy, Holmes had illuminated both the method and the mind behind the deception. Holmes, as we returned to Baker Street, remained contemplative. "Watson, the case is resolved, yet it leaves a mark upon the mind. We have witnessed the extraordinary capabilities of a brilliant intellect, and the subtle manipulations it can impose upon ordinary perception. It is a reminder that even the smallest details may contain the greatest truths, if only one observes with care." I recorded his reflections faithfully, conscious that this adventure, like so many others, would endure as a testament to his unparalleled skill. The household at Chesham Place could rest. London could breathe easier, and yet the echoes of the clock that struck alone would linger in memory, a silent, mechanical reminder of the power of intellect, misdirection, and observation. As dusk fell over the city, Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes distant yet sharp. "Watson," he said quietly. Cases such as this remind us that the mind, when applied with precision and subtlety, can create wonders and illusions alike. It is our duty to untangle them, to bring order from deception, and to preserve the clarity that truth provides. I nodded silently, humbled and inspired. The mystery had concluded, yet its lessons remained vivid, a testament to Holmes's genius and the inexorable power of reason. We had scarcely settled back at Baker Street when the remnants of fog from Chesham Place still seemed to cling to Holmes's mood. Though the case had been resolved to the satisfaction of the Yard and of Mr. Thorne's household, my friend was not yet content to let the matter rest. There was, as he put it, unfinished business, not of evidence, but of comprehension. For Holmes, solving a case was never merely the apprehension of a culprit. It was the intellectual dissection of motive, method, and psychology, the anatomy of crime itself. That morning, the breakfast table lay untouched save for the remnants of tea and a few scribbled pages, while Holmes sat cross-legged upon the settee, pipe in hand, his eyes fixed upon the curling smoke, as if the vapour itself contained the missing fragment of understanding. "I have been considering, Watson," said he at length, "the peculiar nature of Alistair Wren's intellect. It is a dangerous thing when genius loses its moral compass, yet I find myself oddly sympathetic toward the man. Tell me, have you reflected upon what drove him to such elaborate deception?" "I have," I replied cautiously. "It strikes me that vanity more than malice guided his hand. The man sought to be seen, to prove his superiority by crafting fear." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely so. Yet there is more. Vanity, when allied to isolation, becomes a kind of madness. Wren possessed an intellect of remarkable order, but no audience fit to comprehend it. Thorne dismissed him, society ignored him, and so his mind, starved of recognition, turned inward upon itself. His theatre became the household, his instrument a clock, his applause, the astonishment of terrified observers. It is the tragedy of brilliance unacknowledged. He drew a long breath, letting the smoke drift toward the ceiling. There is a lesson there, Watson. The craving to demonstrate superiority, when untethered from empathy, can lead a man to deception as surely as greed or revenge." I had no answer, for the truth of his words struck too close to the bone. I had seen through long acquaintance the loneliness that often accompanied Holmes's own brilliance, though in him it was tempered by discipline and an austere devotion to truth. Wren lacked such ballast. His genius had turned inward and sour. A knock at the door interrupted our reflections. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, whose habitual briskness was softened by the satisfaction of a case neatly concluded. He carried a sheaf of papers, and after the usual courtesies, laid them upon the table. "Your man Wren has been rather talkative, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade. "He's confessed freely enough, though half his speech is an engineer's babble that makes no sense to the constables. He claims he meant no harm, only to demonstrate perception through illusion, whatever that's supposed to mean. The magistrate will see him next week." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "You will find, Inspector, that his confession will corroborate every detail of our deductions. His aim was not destruction, but demonstration, a spectacle devised to prove his intellectual mastery. A pitiable motive, but not without fascination." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "Well, fancy motives or no, he'll answer for it all the same. The Thorne fellow's satisfied, the newspapers have their headline, and I can return to something less ghostly." After the inspector departed, Holmes turned once more to his notes. "Observe, Watson, how human folly manifests in form as well as motive. Wren's contraptions, ingenious though they were, betrayed the very flaw that undid him. An excess of symmetry. His desire for perfection left patterns too regular to escape detection. A human mind, unencumbered by obsession, would have introduced chaos, random variation, inconsistency. But Wren could not. His clock struck not merely alone, but too precisely alone. The phrase lingered in the air. I realized then that Holmes was not merely describing the mechanism, but the man himself, a clock wound by intellect, ticking in solitude. Later that afternoon, we received a brief note from Mr. Thorne, expressing gratitude and enclosing a generous honorarium. Holmes placed the envelope aside without a glance. "Payment," he said quietly, "is never the true reward. Understanding is." His mood softened as the day wore on. He brought forth Wren's sketches, recovered from the man's lodgings, and examined them under the lamp. They were remarkable drawings, delicate and precise. Interlocking gears, pendulums shaped to alter tone, sound chambers designed to carry whispers through wood and plaster. It was the work of a true savant, one who understood not only mechanism, but the resonance of space itself. "Look here, Watson," he said, pointing to a marginal note. "The ear deceives where the eye is firm." Profound, is it not? He grasped the psychology of perception better than most physicians. Yet he used that knowledge not to enlighten, but to bewilder. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "It is an old story. Science turned to spectacle. Were I less anchored by purpose, I might have gone the same way. Fortunately, I have you, my dear fellow, to remind me that there are better audiences than the ghosts one invents for oneself." I laughed quietly, touched by the rare note of warmth in his tone. "And you, Holmes, remind me that even the most rational man needs the company of mystery." He regarded me with that curious half-smile of his. "Then we are well matched, Watson." That evening, after a simple supper, Holmes grew restless. He rose from his chair and began to play softly upon his violin, a melancholy air that carried a wistful beauty. I watched in silence, sensing that his thoughts were still among the ticking gears and whispered illusions of Chesham Place. When the music ceased, he turned toward the fire. "You see, Watson, the most perilous illusions are not those projected upon walls or floors, but those the mind casts upon itself." Wren believed he could master perception, that by manipulating sound and sequence he might command belief. Yet in doing so he became enslaved by his own creation. The clock that struck alone became the echo of his isolation. There is a sort of poetic justice in that, do you not think? "Indeed," said I, "and yet a melancholy one." Holmes nodded slowly. All justice carries a shadow of melancholy. But come, let us not grow sentimental. The world is full of new enigmas, and I dare say the yard will not remain idle for long. He rose, stretching his long limbs, and glanced toward the window, where the last of the daylight was fading into mist. "Another case, another clock to unwind. I confess, Watson, I find the ordinary world somewhat dull when deprived of mystery." I smiled, pen poised above my notebook. "Then, my friend, I trust the world will not disappoint you." He inclined his head with a trace of amusement. "It rarely does." As I recorded those final words, the lamplight flickered across the familiar walls of Baker Street, casting elongated shadows that danced like phantoms of memory. The case of the clock that struck alone had ended, yet its echo lingered, a haunting reminder of intellect, isolation, and the fragile line between genius and madness. Outside, the city resumed its ceaseless hum. carriages clattering over cobblestones, the cries of newsboys, the faint tolling of distant bells, each sound a testament to life continuing in its intricate rhythm. And in that rhythm, Holmes found both his challenge and his solace. It was on the morning of the third day following the resolution of the Chesham Place affair that I found Holmes already awake, standing by the hearth in his dressing gown, staring down at an unfolded telegram with that peculiar gleam which I had long learned to interpret as the herald of fresh intrigue. "You are abroad early, Holmes," said I, setting aside the paper and drawing the curtains to admit the pale London light. "Is it news from Lestrade?" "Hardly, my dear Watson," he replied, his tone clipped but charged with suppressed energy. "The Yard for once believes all is settled. No, this," he tapped the telegram with a forefinger, "comes from an altogether more curious quarter. It seems our clockmaker, Alistair Wren, was not the solitary inventor we presumed him to be." I raised my brows. "You mean there was an accomplice?" Holmes shook his head. "Accomplice, no. Precursor, perhaps. Listen to this. Reference to Wren's designs found in archives of deceased horologist Edmund Selby, late of Limehouse. Possible connection to anomalous mechanism seized in 1890 theft. Papers in estate sale tomorrow. It is signed by Tobias Greaves, curator at the British Horological Society. The man is no alarmist. If Greaves sends such a message, there is substance behind it." He flung the telegram upon the table, seized his hat, and began pacing briskly. "You recall, Watson, that Wren's contraption in Chesham Place employed a resonance device of unusual delicacy, one that could amplify a sound within timber, yet remain inaudible outside the immediate chamber. We left the hall in silence. The evening fog was rolling in once more, swallowing the towers of the Strand. Holmes paused at the steps, glancing back toward the college. "It is over, Watson. The clock has struck its final note." I looked at him curiously. "And Wren's ghost?" He gave a soft, sardonic laugh. "Ah, that ghost will haunt only those who mistake illusion for knowledge. Fortunately, we have work enough in the waking world to keep our minds clear." As we hailed a cab and rolled away into the gathering mist, I could not help glancing at the copper disc Holmes carried wrapped in his coat. Its surface gleamed faintly in the lamplight, as though some echo of its unnatural music still lingered within. Holmes caught my glance and smiled. "Fear not, my dear Watson. This clock shall never strike again." Yet, in the silence that followed, I thought only for an instant that I heard it, a faint, solitary tick, like the heartbeat of a secret the world was not yet done keeping. It was long past midnight when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and shining under the lamplight, and the fog, thinner now, curled like weary ghosts about the gas lamps. London slept uneasily that night, though I suspected that Holmes's mind, like mine, would find no rest. Inside our familiar rooms, the fire burned low. The copper disc, the instrument that had so nearly driven a hall of men mad, lay upon Holmes's workbench, wrapped in oilcloth. He had not spoken since we left the police station, where Varden had been remanded for examination. His silence at first I attributed to exhaustion, but as the clock on the mantel ticked steadily toward 1, I sensed a tension in him that was more than weariness. At length he poured himself a measure of brandy and stood at the window, gazing into the drifting mist. "You heard it too, Watson?" he said suddenly. I looked up. "Heard what?" "The tick," I hesitated. "I thought it only imagination. A remnant of that dreadful sound." He turned sharply. No, not imagination. Something persisted. A vibration so faint that the ear cannot catch it unaided, yet the mind perceives it nonetheless. The question, my dear fellow, is why? I knew better than to interrupt when Holmes was in such a mood. He moved to the bench, unwrapped the oilcloth, and revealed the copper disc. Under the lamplight, its surface gleamed with a strange, dull vitality, neither wholly inert nor entirely metallic. "Observe," said he, taking up his magnifying lens, "the pattern of etchings around the circumference. These are not decorative. They are harmonic inscriptions. Each groove corresponds to a precise frequency. Vardon, in his arrogance, believed he could manipulate the human mind by aligning it with those frequencies. But he erred. In what manner? I asked, in believing he could end the vibration once begun. He set the lens down and began to pace, hands clasped behind his back. Selby's original design sought to study resonance, the natural sympathetic vibration of matter and thought. Vardon, however, sought dominion. He believed consciousness could be tuned like an instrument. But he failed to consider the one element no man controls, the echo. The echo? Holmes nodded gravely. Every vibration produces its twin, a faint reflection that lingers after the sound is gone. In the physical world we call it resonance. In the human mind we call it memory. Once awakened, it persists. His words sent a chill through me. Then you believe what we experienced at King's College? The voices, the illusions, were echoes. Precisely. Echoes conjured by the device's harmonic interference with the brain's perceptual rhythm. A dangerous experiment, but not supernatural. Yet, he paused, eyes narrowing. There is something in that final tick I cannot explain. It was not auditory, nor mechanical. It was, if I may borrow a phrase, an idea made sound. He stood in silence for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then, with a sudden resolve, he drew the copper disc toward him and reached for his violin. "Holmes!" I cried. "Surely you do not mean only to test, Watson?" "Nothing more." He tuned the violin with swift, deft motions, then drew the bow across the strings in a long, low note. The sound filled the room, melancholy, pure, resonant. He adjusted the pitch slightly, and as the tone deepened, the copper disc upon the table gave a faint tremor. "There," he murmured. "Do you see it? It responds as if alive." The string quivered again, and the disc emitted a sound so soft it might have been imagined. A single ghostly chime, like a clock striking in a dream. Holmes lowered the bow. The mechanism is no longer powered, yet it sings. The metal remembers. I felt an unease creeping over me. Then it cannot be destroyed. "Oh, it can be destroyed, Watson," said he, his tone distant. "But perhaps it ought not to be. There is something to be learned here, though not, I think, by any man alive." He took the disc, wrapped it once more in cloth, and locked it in a small iron chest beside his chemical apparatus. "There," he said quietly, "let us leave the echo to sleep." We sat in silence for some time, the only sound the steady ticking of our mantel clock. At last Holmes spoke again, more softly. "You recall Vardon's final words?" "The resonance remains," I said. "Just so. He was correct, though not in the way he imagined. What lingers is not some cursed vibration, but the eternal persistence of cause and effect. Every action, however minute, sends ripples outward. That is the truest echo, Watson. The moral resonance of human folly." He poured another measure of brandy and raised it slightly, as if in grim toast. To Selby, whose genius was pure, to Vardon, whose ambition was fatal, and to the clock that struck alone, may its silence endure. Outside, Big Ben tolled the quarter hour. Holmes listened, head slightly bowed. Do you hear it, Watson? The honest sound of time. No illusion, no distortion, only the rhythm of the world itself. It is a comforting music, is it not? I smiled faintly. After what we have witnessed today, I find it a blessing. Holmes returned to his chair and stretched his long limbs before the fire. The lines of tension around his eyes softened. We chase phantoms, Watson, yet in the end it is always the human heart that beats at their centre. Every mystery resolves not into magic, but into motive. He leaned back, eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Still, I confess, there are nights when reason falters, and one almost hears the echo. As he spoke, the wind rose outside, brushing against the panes with a low, rhythmic sigh. For an instant the sound seemed to blend with the ticking clock, two pulses overlapping in perfect unison. Then, as suddenly, the harmony broke, leaving only silence. Holmes opened his eyes, the faintest glimmer of amusement in them. You see, Watson, even the wind remembers. He reached for his violin once more, and drew from it a slow, plaintive melody, a requiem for the mind that sought to command sound itself. The music lingered long after he set the instrument down. When at last I retired, I paused at the door and looked back. Holmes sat motionless by the dying fire, the iron chest at his feet, the shadows playing across his face. For a moment I thought I saw him glance toward the mantel clock and nod, as though acknowledging an unseen companion. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "Good night, old friend." Whether he meant me or the ticking clock, I could not tell. Epilogue. The copper disc was never mentioned again in any official report. Varden was committed to an asylum on the outskirts of Surrey, where he lived quietly until his death 2 years later. Selby's remaining notes were sealed by order of the Home Office at Holmes's discreet recommendation. And as for the clock that struck alone, Holmes kept it locked away, even from me. Yet on certain winter nights, when all of Baker Street slept and the fog pressed against the window panes, I could have sworn I heard it. Not loud, but certain, tick, once and never again. It has been many years since the affair of the clock that struck alone found its curious conclusion. I write these lines not at Baker Street, but at my modest home in Kensington, where the ticking of a small mantel clock keeps me company through the long, quiet hours of old age. It is an ordinary clock, nothing of science or mystery about it. And yet, on certain nights, when the fire burns low and my thoughts drift backward through time, its rhythm carries me once more to that mist-shrouded world where reason and wonder so often walked hand in hand. Of Sherlock Holmes, little remains to be said that has not already been recorded in the annals of his singular career. Yet there are episodes, small human fragments, that belong not to the history books, but to memory. And it is of one such fragment, born in the quiet aftermath of that strange adventure, that I wish to speak. A fortnight after the case was concluded, I received from Holmes a note written in his sharp, slanted hand. "My dear Watson, I am departing London for a time. There are investigations of a more contemplative nature that call to me. Matters of vibration, music, and the philosophy of perception. Pray, do not be alarmed if I vanish from society for a spell. The silence of thought is sometimes louder than the noise of men. S.H." It was not unlike him to retreat thus, though the tone, meditative, almost wistful, struck me as uncharacteristic. He left without farewell, taking with him only a violin case, a small travelling bag, and I suspected that infernal copper disc which had so nearly unseated the minds of men. Months passed before I saw him again. Then, one crisp autumn morning, as I walked along the embankment, I spied a tall, familiar figure standing by the river railings, his gaze fixed upon the slow churn of the Thames. He looked older, thinner perhaps, though there was a calmness about him I had rarely seen. "My dear Holmes!" I exclaimed. He turned with a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, you see the river still keeps its secrets." We strolled together for some distance, speaking little. At last I ventured to ask what had become of the disk. "It sleeps," said Holmes quietly, "under the foundation stones of an old abbey in Surrey, a fitting tomb for a folly of the intellect. I learned all that could be learned from it, and more than is safe for any man to know." I pressed him for an explanation, but he shook his head. "Some experiments, my dear fellow, are better left as questions. Knowledge without restraint is merely a subtler form of madness. Varden taught us that much." We walked on, and the subject was dropped. Yet I could not help but feel that some part of Holmes had been altered by that encounter with the unseen forces of resonance and mind. He had looked into an abyss of sound, and though he had mastered it, a faint echo, I think, remained within him. After that morning, our meetings grew fewer. The years, relentless in their passage, carried us toward different shores. I married again, practiced medicine, and grew comfortable in my domestic obscurity. Holmes withdrew first to Sussex, to his beloved bees, and then, as the years deepened, into what I can only describe as a private silence. Letters came at long intervals, always brief, often cryptic. In one he wrote, "There is a curious symmetry, Watson, between the hum of bees and the ticking of clocks. Both are steady, industrious, and eternal. Perhaps in the end all life is but a resonance, a vibration fading gently into the universal quiet." That was Holmes at his most philosophical. I fancied that solitude and advancing years had softened his once iron logic into a kind of contemplative poetry, and yet beneath it I could still sense the sharpness of the mind that had outwitted so many criminals, and confounded even death itself. The last time I saw him was in the spring of 1913. The war clouds had not yet gathered, but the air of Europe was heavy with foreboding. I had journeyed down to Sussex on some private errand, and could not resist calling at his cottage. He greeted me warmly, though with that same tranquil detachment that had grown upon him in later life. The room was spare. Books, chemical flasks, the faint scent of tobacco. Upon a small wooden shelf stood a curious object, a clock, old-fashioned and ornate, its face covered with a thin layer of dust. Holmes noticed my gaze. "Yes," he said softly. "The clock that struck alone," I started. "Surely not the clock?" "No, merely its likeness," he replied. "I constructed it myself, without the infernal resonator, of course. A harmless reminder that even in silence, time speaks." He wound it once, gently, and the hands began to move. The sound was steady, comforting, and very human. "You see, Watson," he said, "all our deductions, our theories, our triumphs, they are but the tickings of a single clock. Each man believes his own rhythm to be the true one, but beyond it lies the greater cadence, the rhythm of the universe itself. When we attune to it, we are wise. When we defy it, we go mad." He looked at me with that old glint, half amusement, half affection. "You always did accuse me of speaking in riddles." "I have long since given up the attempt to solve you," I said. He laughed, a rare, genuine laugh. "Then you are wiser than most of Scotland Yard." We spoke for some hours, of the old days, of London, of Lestrade and Mrs. Hudson, of those vanished years when adventure waited behind every fog-drenched corner. When I rose to go, he walked with me to the gate. As I turned back once, I saw him standing there in the fading light, the wind stirring his grey hair. He lifted his hand in a brief gesture of farewell, and I, foolishly sentimental, thought of that strange night so long ago, when the clock had struck once, and he had whispered, "Even the wind remembers." I never saw him again. Now, in these twilight years, I often wonder if he is still out there somewhere. Not in body, perhaps, but in that realm of thought he so often inhabited, where logic meets imagination, and every sound carries its own invisible echo. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can almost hear it. Not the dreadful resonance of Varden's device, but the quieter rhythm of Holmes's mind. Precise, relentless, utterly unique. Tick, deduction, tick, observation, tick, truth. The clock beside me strikes the hour. I rise, lay down my pen, and listen as its echo fades into silence. If there is any justice in the design of the world, any harmony in its hidden machinery, then somewhere, I think, Holmes still listens to that eternal rhythm, his keen mind forever measuring, reasoning, deducing in the quiet beyond sound. And when my own time comes, and I cross whatever threshold separates knowledge from mystery, I like to think I shall find him waiting, perhaps beside some celestial fireplace, violin in hand, and he will look up, that familiar gleam in his eye, and say with gentle mockery, "Ah, Watson, you are late. The clock has already struck once."